No mai haere mai ki te Aotearoa, or Crazy and Ambitious Mead Kaurilands Summit. Welcome everybody to day one, session 1. And Ambitious 3 conference, which also features the Kaurilands. My name is Andrea. I'm going to introduce myself to you all in a minute. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to Mātua Kevan Prime, Ngāti and Ambassador for Bioheritage, to open our wānanga today. Kia ora, Mātua Kevan.
Kia ora. Tēnā koe Andrea tuku mai na tēnei hone re kia, nā reira kia inoi tātou. He pāe tō mātou matu nui te rangi. Ko koe hoki te atua kaharawa ora tūnu. Nāi mātou e whakaora taino ki tukimatanga o tēnei hui noho, hui ngā, i runga i te Tūhorangi. Māu, ngā kā mātou e tia ki aene, kaunoki mātou e tuka ke takai tēnei rā ki te hara. Kia rere rāne roto i te mate, engari tohu hui ai whakatika ai a koe a mātou mahi katoa kia ori te ki tāwi hiri ai. Tuku e te māramatanga kia mātou me te aro nui ki ngā kai kōrero i roto i tēnei hononga e pā i runga i te Tūhorangi, mo te roa ngā kia o tēnei hui huinga, kia tautonu e umana ki tanga ki runga i te katoa ki ngā kai kōrero. Whakapuare mai a mātou ngā kaue pā, ki te hopu i ngā kōrero o rātou whakāturanga i tēnei rā. Ko te ino ki tēnei ki a koe pā, mauna rai whakamana mai. I runga ni te ngā tāutama, te kai whakaora koe Ukraiti. Āmene. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Kevan. Nau mai anō koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko maukatiru te maunga, turu nei takangako. Ko rakahuri te awa, nei aku mā harahara. Ke te mahi ahau he kai tohu motuhake mō ngā mea o te taio. Ka noho au he tangata tiriti mō ake tonu atu. E noho ana au ki Waitaha I nainei, ko Andrea toko ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody this morning. My name is Andrea. My research background is on introduced animal pests and their impacts on New Zealand's native flora and fauna. And I'm a former co-director of this National Science Challenge. Atamari e koutou. Welcome to you all online this morning. Between the two wānanga we have today, both the Crazy and Ambitious 3 conference and the Kaurilands Summit, the aim is showcasing the absolute latest tiriti-led biodiversity and biosecurity research from around Aotearoa, New Zealand. The researchers that you're going to hear over the next 4 days are going to be joined by community members and other knowledge holders to demonstrate mahitahi in action, collaboration with impact. The keynote and the guest speakers are going to share their visions for the future of Te Taio. So please sit back, relax and join me and our wonderful chair for this session, Susanna, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, and all the speakers on a journey through day one with the vision, Mauri ora, ngā koe ora tuku iho. Our biological heritage is thriving. Before I do introduce Susanna, what I'm going to do first of all is do a little bit of housekeeping just to set the scene for this platform. So first of all, if you've got any technical issues and questions, please use the live support. During the sessions, you can access that on the right-hand side or from your foyer screen outside of the sessions. If you've got any viewing issues due to your internet bandwidth, that will be me. Perhaps throughout the day, I've got rural broadband. Don't hesitate to click on the audio/video issues text, which is right below the video, and you can choose one of the backup streams, and those are a lower latency. Closed captions are available for all the sessions, so please just click on the CC button, and you should be able to access that. This virtual platform allows opportunities for you to connect with other attendees, and We really do encourage you to stick with the program and stay with us during the day. You'll get the most out of the experience, so use the meeting hub and the exhibition stands. These virtual platforms, if you haven't used one before, they're absolutely fantastic for online networking. So make use of them in the break times. You might have noticed that there are some amazing prizes up for grabs, so don't forget to click the Win Points button to get in amongst it. If you haven't checked out the prizes, they're on the conference website. They're absolutely incredible. And then finally, and most importantly, in terms of the interactions, just throughout the whole conference, don't forget to submit questions in the live Q&A. We're going to be monitoring that, and we'll do our best to get the speakers to answer those questions during the panel discussions at the end of each of the sessions. So just a reminder, the platform and the technical questions, that is live support, not the Q&A function. Don't ask your technical questions in the Q&A function. Use the Q&A for what it's intended, which is to interact with the speakers. I'm going to now turn our focus to the theme for this first session, which is woven around the Eco-Index outcome area in this National Science Challenge. I'm going to briefly introduce our session chair, Susanna Finlay-Smits. Susanna has a dual background in anthropology and biochemistry, and she's a social researcher. She's got a particular focus at the intersection of a number of disciplines across sustainability, biosecurity, and biodiversity issues. She's undertaking a number of research programs throughout this National Science Challenge. And we're going to come back to Susanna, and I'm sure she's going to introduce herself properly in a little while. But first, and without further ado, it's my huge privilege to introduce Aroha Mead for the keynote presentation for this session. Aroha is of Ngāti Porou, and Tuhourangi descent. She's an independent research principal specialising in mātauranga and Indigenous knowledge, Māori and Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights, decolonising conservation and taxonomic collections, and repatriation of taonga and data. If you've not heard Aroha speak before, you're in for an absolute treat. It's a huge privilege on my part to open this conference with Aroha as the keynote speaker. I'm going to hand over to her now, and we'll come back to questions at the end. And then Susanna will then pick up and chair the remainder of this session. Nau mai, Aroha.
Kia ora koutou katoa. First of all, can you hear me? Great. For the presentation, and thanks for this opportunity to connect with you, although from my presenter's view I can't see you. But anyway, let me go through my presentation, which I've called Reimagining Conservation in Aotearoa. I have but 20 minutes to talk about this amazing topic, and I'll also be providing an update on the Māori Community Conservation Project, which our team has been working on. So just a little bit about me, who I am. I've actually been in this space for a long period of time, so I come to this topic not simply as someone pontificating a personal view, but as someone who has delved deeply into the history of conservation and has been an active contributor to the development of new conservation norms and standards nationally and globally. And I'd like to highlight a paper published back in 2004 called He Pāua He Korowai Me Ngā Wāhi Tapu. I chose these 3 points of reference: collecting and safely eating shellfish, harvesting and using traditional weaving materials, including for commercial purposes, and having continued access to customary sacred places, as they seem then and still do now to be good indicators of the complex myriad of legislation and policies that influence cultural and environmental well-being. So reimagining conservation, let me make this point at the outset. What we need is a system based on a vision that biodiversity is a shared responsibility. It's everyone's business, it's everyone's responsibility, and the best way to achieve buy-in is to enable greater participation of key groups into decision-making. What we need is an inclusive, decentralized conservation system that enables multiple parties to assume responsibility for the well-being of biodiversity and ecosystems and landscapes at place, with mana whenua taking a central role together with the Crown, community groups and private sector, prioritising the well-being of Indigenous biodiversity. What we have is simply not working. There are multiple terms I could use to describe the current conservation system, but any descriptive term would simply be a distraction from where the focus should be, which is the outcome. What we have is an outdated conservation system that comprises over 24 statutes, such as the Wildlife Act, Marine Reserves Act, and Marine Mammals Act, dating back to 1953, 1971, and 1978, respectively, with some provisions expressly prohibiting delegation of responsibilities to iwi and non-Crown bodies. It assigns ownership to the Crown, and ownership in a very perverse sense: surface, subsurface, lands, waters, and even species. Is unable to resource management of the existing conservation estate, but keeps accumulating more. Has neglected large tracts of the estate and failed to manage multiple predators, and has forced Māori into a humiliating cycle of having to apply to access customary sites and use customary materials. All of this accumulatively causing harm to the well-being of the treaty partners, hapu iwi Māori, and to the environment. It's not fit for purpose now, and definitely not fit for the scale of concerns we face in the future. Sorry, the screen is so small that trying to find where I have to push buttons is a challenge. So the evidence that our current system is not working is overwhelming. This is not just my opinion. Whether you look through the lens of biodiversity or treaty jurisprudence, the statistics say it all. At risk, 76% of our Indigenous freshwater species, 90% of our seabirds, 80% shorebirds, 84% reptiles, although this figure on the right was subsequently updated by Stats New Zealand in December 2021 to 94% of reptiles at risk of becoming threatened or becoming extinct. And almost 50% of our Indigenous vascular plants are at risk. The statistics are dire. Biodiversity is steadily declining at an alarming rate, not only at species level, but entire ecosystems and landscapes are in various stages of collapse. Biodiversity has not fared well under the system, and if we do not change the system as a matter of urgency, the downward spiral of decline will continue to get worse in our lifetime, through our actions and inactions. We are not being good ancestors when it comes to Indigenous biodiversity. So let's look at the enabling legislation. The Conservation Act itself came into effect in 1987. The first treaty settlement was 2 years later in 1989, the Waitomo Caves settlement, followed by the Sealord Fisheries settlement in 1992, Waikato Tainui in 1995, and Ngāi in 1998. By the year 2020, 73 treaty settlements had been enacted into law, many with conservation, co-management and co-governance provisions. The Conservation Act simply doesn't speak to any of them. There is also growing treaty jurisprudence that requires the Crown in general and specifically DOC, to strengthen its treaty relationships. Turning now to the definition of conservation as articulated in the Act. The definition is important as it provides the justification for the purpose of conservation. And according to the Act, conservation means the preservation and protection of natural and historic resources for the purpose of maintaining their intrinsic values, providing for their appreciation and recreational enjoyment by the public, and safeguarding the options for future generations. There are no references to Indigenous biodiversity or to kaitiakitanga or mātauranga or the treaty or iwi Māori in this definition. Nothing that distinguishes this as being of Aotearoa. Also conspicuously missing are any references in the whole of the Conservation Act to terms such as biodiversity, invasive species, predators, kaitiakitanga, mātauranga, climate change, goals, outcomes, targets. A Conservation Act that makes no mention of biodiversity. How can we say this Act speaks to conservation in Aotearoa in 2022 or is fit for the future? For the next 5 slides, I'm going to speak more directly to the involvement of the Biological Heritage Challenge in the issues covered in this presentation. So the Options Development Group was established by the former Director General of DOC. Both Tamir, Malcolm and myself, challenge researchers, were members of the ODG. We met from August 2019 to undertake a partial review of the Conservation General Policy and General Policy for National Parks. The ODG completed its work in December 2021 and submitted its final report to the new Director General, Penny Nelson. The main drivers behind this review were the Supreme Court's judgment in the Ngāi ki Tamaki case, which was the first time in over 20 years that the Superior Courts had considered DOC's responsibilities under Section 4 of the Conservation Act. The other drivers included the Waitangi Tribunal's report, regarding the Y262 claim, but also this particular government's priority to build closer partnerships with Māori and across Crown agencies. Now, how did we get from the ODG to Nelson Mandela? As well as showing off this photo that I did have the immense honour of meeting him, I'm recalling that the ODG's review included the National Parks General Policy. The ODG discussed in detail the department's management of the conservation estate and the issue of the legacy of protected areas and their adverse impact on the lives, livelihoods and territories of Indigenous peoples globally was actually the subject of the 5th World Parks Congress, where Congress patron President Nelson Mandela made this comment in his opening address: "I see no future for parks unless they address the needs of communities by taking communities as equal parts." The same meeting adopted the Durban Accord, which said, "In this changing world, we need a fresh and innovative approach to protected areas and their role in broader conservation and development agendas," and voiced concern that many places which have been conserved over the ages by Indigenous peoples are not given due recognition, protection and support. Their contributions are invisible in national accounting of protected areas and often left out of biodiversity status reports. It seemed to the ODG that over 10 years later, the same experience is mirrored here in Aotearoa with Māori community conservation and community conservation in general not being fully recognised for their valuable contributions. It is this very issue that underpins the Māori Community Conservation Project Jason Talianakis and myself are leading within this challenge, as well as other challenge initiatives. Going back to the ODG's recommendations, after considerable analysis and very robust debate, the ODG unanimously decided upon a range of recommendations grouped under 7 themes. I won't read through all of them, but rather point out that it was seen as extremely important to undertake a fundamental reform of the conservation system, that trying to deal with just general policy or just the Conservation Act in itself would not be sufficient to address the scale of the problems that we're facing. So reframing the purpose of conservation to ensure it is fit for purpose for Aotearoa, actually bringing into the conservation system tried and true protocols for the human-nature interaction with mātauranga, tikanga and kaua, and actually looking at recasting the legal status of conservation lands, waters, resources, Indigenous species and other taonga. We simply couldn't see how, if the Crown cannot afford to manage the species it currently owns, that it is sustainable to continue with that model. There are many who would be more than happy to take over the main responsibility. And in fact, the whole notion of owning parts of nature we found to be sort of unhelpful to achieve proper conservation outcomes. So, as well as participation of 2 challenge researchers in the ODG itself, a different group of challenge researchers analysed the ODG's recommendations and published in March of this year a policy briefing. Diversity of backgrounds and worldviews are crucial for effective conservation outcomes. So this paper suggests that Aotearoa needs to move to an inclusive conservation framework, which is not possible within the current legislation, noting that national and international research suggests that such a framework would provide better biodiversity outcomes by leveraging our nation's unique Indigenous knowledge and engaging a greater proportion of society in the broader goal of sustaining our biological heritage. Over the next few days, a range of challenge researchers will be sharing aspects of their work that also directly contributes towards the system change I've been speaking about, and in particular the Eco Index, which sets a 100-year vision and targets for biodiversity. So in terms of the progress we have made to date in the Māori Community Conservation Project, I'm pleased to report that portfolios have been collected for 463 sites across both the North and South Island. This particular map shows 117 of these sites. I was reminded again last night by team member Sandy Wakefield that this is not just another mapping project. Behind every dot or polygon on the map is a story. Who, where, what, why, and how. And we therefore are able to develop a much clearer picture of how diverse Māori involvement in conservation actually is. Who, the information collected goes beyond merely identifying mana whenua as the host Māori community to identifying hapu and marae, taumata or marae-led leadership, runanga tribal authorities, Māori land block trust, Māori-run businesses, hapu and iwi-led initiatives. We realise that Māori are organising themselves to lead large-scale conservation projects and work in partnership with DOC and local councils. So the notion of Māori community is far more complex than one might think. Once we find out who and how communities organise themselves to run community projects, We then find out the where and the what. For example, lakes, harbours, alpine, estuaries, seabeds, and forested areas help us to illustrate some of the focus areas of where project work is carried out and where the project work effects change. The map also holds data on which pests and predators and diseases are being targeted in every project and include key environmental and social pressures being addressed. For example, climate change, tourism, farming, forestry, erosion, pollution, or urbanisation. The project portfolios also record a number of mātauranga fields, such as renewal of a mauri, restoring ancestral landscapes and narratives, maramataka Māori practices, reviving customary knowledge and practices, rāhui or mataitai, wānanga and other mechanisms. And we also record objectives where they exist. So within these diverse organisations, project emphasis and outcomes can range from rangatahi training, taonga species relocation, iwi history restoration, mahinga kai restoration, and in turn this could be achieved through mahi rangahau, wānanga Māori community engagement, habitat renewal, restoring natural features and scientific research, etc. So coming back to the earlier point that each polygon tells a very rich story. So the data will help increase knowledge of the extent to which community-placed initiatives, mostly volunteers, are in fact the backbone of conservation in Aotearoa, spanning species and ecosystem restoration to predator control to trialling innovative solutions based on a blending of mātauranga and science to solve conservation problems. Finally, this is my last slide. So coming back to reimagining conservation and what we can do, I think the three po that sort of underpin the work of this challenge, whakamana, tiaki, and whakahau, are very relevant to what we can do and what we are doing. So whakamana to empower, support the Options Development Group's recommendations, be an ally, be a supporter, be prepared for change and advocate change. Reflect that system change that we know is needed through ensuring that the research that we undertake within the challenge makes a transformative difference at place and to communities. And restore not only biodiversity but equity. Ensure that at every table effort is focused on increasing Indigenous biodiversity and mana whenua involvement. And with these comments, I'd just like to thank you all for the time and wish us all a successful conference over the next few days. I'm happy to take any questions if time permits. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Aroha, nui kia koe. Thank you for your deeply insightful presentation. As usual, I enjoyed it immensely. There is actually a couple of minutes, for questions. I don't actually see any questions in the live Q&A. I suspect that maybe people are going to be a little bit a little bit shy this morning to start off with the questioning. So I did anticipate that, and I've actually got one. I'm going to cheat because I heard Tami ask you this question the other night at the Te Tera Whakamātaki forum that they had online as well. And the question was, if we were to undertake the fundamental conservation reform that you outlined in the work of the Options Development Group, would you start with a blank slate, throw everything out and start again, or would we build on what we have currently?
Yes, that's a very complicated question. There are some pieces of legislation that, such as the Wildlife Act, that just require a major rethink. And gladly, that particular piece of legislation is currently on the table for review. There are other parts of the conservation system that are working reasonably well. They just need to be tweaked a little bit more to bring them up to date. The biggest issue is actually around the capacity of DOC staff to be able to operate in a system where Crown ownership isn't the overriding reason for why they get involved. Like, I've been spending quite a bit of time with kaitiaki delivering at place, and universally the experience across the country is one of DOC being seen as interfering, not only wanting to be at every table, but wanting to lead at every table, even though they're not bringing anything extra to that table. And it's stifling innovation. It's stifling being able to motivate people to change behaviours or to dedicate time and resources to ecosystem restoration. So some things we can keep and tweak. Other things we have to fundamentally rethink. I think the Conservation Act is another act that needs a fundamental rethink, because it's not really it's more of a permissions act. It sets out a whole process by which the department gives permits for recreational activities such as hunting and fishing. And we need something that actually addresses conservation. As I said, to have a Conservation Act in 2022 that doesn't mention biodiversity or mātauranga, I think is all the evidence we need to say that that needs a major overhaul.
Thank you. Okay. And with that, what I'm going to do is close it off. Sadly, there is actually one more question in the Q&A, Aroha, around marine conservation and the EEZ. And I do wonder if you've got time, you wouldn't mind dropping in there. I'm sure some people would like to hear some more answers. So thank you for your presentation. It's much appreciated. I'm going to move on now and hand over to Susanna, our chair, who's now going to pick up and chair the remainder of this session. And I'd like to get her to introduce the research project, the Eco Index. Thank you.
Kia ora, and thank you, Andrea. So the first program of work that we are going to hear about today is the Eco Index, and that program holds that New Zealanders value their unique natural environments, but national and regional reporting shows that native biodiversity of Aotearoa is degraded and under continued threat. They propose that a better approach is needed and indeed possible to protect and restore our native flora and fauna. The Eco Index team have developed a long-term vision for a future with thriving biodiversity, but their key point of difference is that they are supporting this vision with the targets and guidance needed to get the job done. Today, we're going to hear about the exciting and comprehensive new approaches that the team are spearheading. Now, first speakers from the Eco Index team are two of the co-leads, John Reid and Payne. Dr. John Reid is a systems analyst with a focus on land, freshwater and ocean sustainability from an Indigenous perspective. John works as both an independent consultant and as a senior research fellow at the University of Canterbury. And Penny is a senior research officer at the University of Waikato with a background in community psychology. Her work focuses on biosecurity, biodiversity and resilience. Tēnā koroa, John and Penny.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Susanna, for the lovely introduction. Susanna and I used to work together. That was lovely. Thank you. Okay, so today, a 100-year National Biodiversity Vision for Aotearoa. We're really excited to launch this with you today. Okay, so just a little bit about the wonderful team who are behind this mahi. We've got a highly interdisciplinary team. We've got data scientists and engineers, ecologists, people who specialise in indicator development, data modelers and data science. Now, if you've heard about the Eco Index, you'll know that our key mandate here is to create a national level biodiversity index for Aotearoa. There are two types of information which feed into this. First of all, how much are we investing in biodiversity, so across all stakeholders in New Zealand? And on the other hand, what is the impact of this investment? What is the current status of our biodiversity? How is it trending? And is all of this investment actually making a difference? And this dovetails nicely into our third work stream, vision, baseline and targets. So we realised early on in developing the Eco Index that we needed to have an idea of where we were headed to. We needed a vision. And this would enable us to measure progress towards that target. So this is what we're showing you today. So this is quite simply our vision: protected, restored and connected 21-21. So I'll unpack each of those parts now. So first of all, these three components are based on three key principles which promote biodiversity. Ecosystem management, so that a managed ecosystem is better than an unmanaged ecosystem in terms of biodiversity outcomes. That increasing native ecosystem extent will promote increased native biodiversity. And finally, that greater connectivity will also promote biodiversity, but there's some nuance there that we'll unpack shortly. Okay, so first, protect, te ake. Let's protect what we've already got. Kia haumaru te mauri o te taio. This is about protecting from current and future threats. And what we mean here is pests, weeds, diseases, excluding stock, protecting from pollution, and also legal protection from things like land clearing and conversion to systems of more monoculture, which will not promote biodiversity. Second, restore, whakahau. Kia whakahoki te mauri o te taio ki te taumata e hia ana tātou. Now this is the crux of the vision here, and we're looking to restore native ecosystems in every catchment to a minimum of 15% of their original extent. So say we had 100,000 hectares of a given ecosystem pre-1840, we want to work to restore that to 15,000 hectares. And it's just to emphasize here that it is a minimum. So if there are already ecosystem types which are above this threshold, we don't want to interrupt those, we just want to get those underrepresented ecosystems up to that threshold. And you might say, why 15%? In the literature, that is the threshold for minimum maintenance of biodiversity. And onto the third component, connect to hono, ko te mauri o te taio, te taukia, hono, mai e utu, te atu ki tai. This is about the mauri of the ecosystem, increasing connectivity of native ecosystems from the mountains to the sea. And we'll explore a little bit more what we mean by connectivity soon, because greater connectivity is not necessarily a good thing for all species. Finally, 21-21, you might say, why a 100-year vision for biodiversity? Why not make it sooner? Well, we did targeted consultation with a range of stakeholder groups across Aotearoa and found that for two groups in particular, a long-term vision was critical. This was industry and iwi. So we know that iwi are already undertaking long-term planning and have been for a long time. And also for industry, this is going to involve transformational change, which will require widespread behaviour change, and so that will take time. So we have set this vision as a realistic goal to achieve together. And I'll hand over to John here.
So we've got strong collaboration across a whole range of areas, including iwi, industry, regional councils, and we're working to set targets with those bodies around the underlying vision we've got here, and also looking at catchment targets, because every catchment's different, and we're all looking for those catchments to kind of hit those 15% targets we're outlining, or that Penny outlined. So just to give you an idea, Penny, can you just forward again so I can show? If you have a look at the far right-hand side here, you'll see there is a thermometer, and this is related to the amount of investment required to protect our biodiversity over a 100-year period. So what we're looking to do is look at how much investment's needed. So here, these are dummy numbers. They're still under development. This is back of the envelope stuff, but we're not far away from having these numbers concretized. But so in this case, we're looking at it's around $140 billion investment over 100 years to reverse biodiversity decline and maintain it. And then if you have a look at this graph, we're also trying to break it down by region. And you can see here on the blue columns, those are the amount of money that's currently being invested in a particular region into pest control, weed control, and fencing. And on all the green columns, you'll see that is the target level required, and that's over the 2022 year. And this here is the restore or the whakahau, 15% of every catchment. Now, if you look from the left to the right, you'll see that the graph goes down. Now, that's because the graph pretty much matches the movement from mountains to the sea. And at the bottom there, you can see all the different ecosystem types. So the higher in elevation you get, the higher percentage of various ecosystem types we have. But the closer you get to the coasts and to the lowland areas, our ecosystems fall well below the 15% target. And so what we need to do is a lot of the focus needs to shift into those areas to be able to get this connections from mountains to the sea. Next, Penny. And you can see this here. How much would it cost to restore these areas? And these sort of, once again, dummy numbers, but estimates around the $210 billion mark to be able to restore ecosystems up to those 15% targets across catchments. Our third theme in regards to our vision is connect, or tūhono. And there's different ways we can connect these ecosystems. One is corridors from, as we're talking about, from mountains to the sea, but also stepping stones. So there's so that different species can move from one area to another. But there's also important elements too around connecting as isolation or protecting areas that act as seeds that can then travel to other areas, and also translocations fit into that bucket. And one way we're looking to measure this is sort of through the distance between forest patches, and these are a range of regions here, and looking at the way in which the levels of connectivity, and we're developing metrics for being able to determine those levels of connectivity. And so what we arrive at is this overall current status picture or dashboard. It will be online that people can log in and look at, but you can see on the far right-hand column, the 2021 total investment target. So this is around, once again, dummy numbers, but around, back of the envelope, around $340 billion needs to be invested to reach that 21 target. And then if you look at the far left-hand table, you'll see the different areas where the investment's needed. So planting, land retirement, this is land that needs to move from current use such as farming into another form, pest and disease eradication, barriers and fencing. You see there's a 2022 target, what we need to do this year, but there's also a 2021 target in terms of what we need to achieve over the next 100 years. And finally, there's the current status, which is an aggregate indicator of the overall health of biodiversity in New Zealand.
Wonderful. Okay, so just to talk about a few key documents that have come out recently and how they dovetail with the Eco Index program. Several reports, such as the State of the Environment one at the bottom there, have mentioned a need for better integrated environmental monitoring systems, of which the Eco Index is a good example of a solution. Also, Te Mana o Te Taio, you might notice that the three components of our vision outlined here were very similar to that outlined in the implementation plan, but our point of difference here is that we've underpinned this by targets, so we can actually track our progress and operationalize this. We also just wanted to highlight a couple of awesome international relationships that we've been developing. So digital public goods are freely online, open resources and infrastructure that are available for the good of everyone. And the Eco Index has been nominated for DPG status. What this means is that it's recognizing that we are international leaders in this space. And as a result, we've been invited to an international digital public goods charter to continue this discussion. We've also been building relationships with the UN Biodiversity Lab, who have data from over 56 countries around the world, providing a high-level dashboard of each country's biodiversity. And that's jointly developed by the UN Environmental Programme and the UN Development Programme. So we're working with them to look at opportunities for interoperability and collaboration. So let's just wrap up with some key points. Our 3 key components of our vision: protecting, restoring and connecting by 2121. And in the coming months, we intend to release more detailed information about targets for industry, iwi, regional council and catchments, which will allow everyone to enact this vision together. And also, we understand that there's data scarcity in the biodiversity space, but it's important that we set these targets now and develop these tools. And we understand that as that data comes online, we'll be able to continually refine and improve it. Thank you everyone very much for your time. If you'd like any more information, our brand new website is available at the top link there, and we've also written a paper about how we developed our vision if you'd like to find out more.
Great, thank you, John and Penny. Our next speaker is Kevan Cote. Kevan is a data scientist and runs Moose Design. He specialises in working in unique applications of machine learning models and is bringing this knowledge and experience to the EcoIndex team to develop classifiers for the broad ecology of Aotearoa. Tēnā koe, Kevan.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my control here. Brilliant. All right, thank you very much. Yeah, for the introduction, I am going to talk to you about how the EcoIndex is using artificial intelligence to develop our native biodiversity. And I really want to start off with the scale of the problem and remind everyone that we are looking at the entirety of New Zealand here, which isn't a very small problem. Most of us will be much more familiar with sort of the ground level being, within the trees and the forests, and being able to look and identify what is around us. In this case, we have a couple young kauri trees here. But if we only looked at that level, we'd be a very small dot on the scale of our problem. As some of you might know, we have about 10 million hectares of forest across Aotearoa, and this would need a small army to do manually, as you can see by all the little dots that I've just sort of drawn in there. And this is really where remote sensing and machine learning come into place and help us out. We're in a very lucky part of our world where we have data such as satellites and airplane imagery that we can grab data from, and it's relatively available. Compared to 20, 30 years ago, we can go on the internet and download this data, which is fantastic. It's very wide coverage. We get to look at the entirety of New Zealand, and some of them are fairly frequent. You can get up to every 10 days, there's some satellites that circle the entire world. There are a few constraints, of course. Generally, they're lower resolution. I've put a little asterisk there because there are some sources of high resolution satellite data as well, and we'll get into that. You don't have control of the flight path, of course. The satellites are in orbit. They're going where they want to. And sometimes they can be expensive as well, and this is variable, especially if you consider chartering a plane to do your own data collection. This is where things like drones can really come into place. They are very high resolution relative to the satellite. You control exactly where the path needs to be. Relatively inexpensive, again, compared to, say, chartering a plane. And it's quite easy to match them with ground truthing, which is, being on the ground and being able to see what you are physically looking at, which is very important for our next step. So we have these data sources. Now we can start looking at what examples we can get from this imagery and this data that we're collecting. And I've only listed a few here, but we can look at things like canopy, colors, and shape with imagery, of course. With different sensors, such as LiDAR and radar, we can start looking at cover densities, as well as ground moisture levels. And what this allows us to do is put all of this data together and create a machine learning model or a neural network. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get too deep into this right now, but I do have an example here. And this is out of Florida, where they use drone data and simply imagery, which is just looking at color patterns, to fly over a fruit orchard and individually identify the canopies of each of these fruit trees. But it just shows you how powerful a machine learning algorithm can be for quickly identifying large areas of trees, such as this. Now, I want to say we aren't the first to this game at all. There's a lot of examples of this research already done. One of the huge players in the game, of course, is Manaki Whenua. And we've actually partnered with them to do a preliminary analysis that we will be continuing work with as well. I've also listed a few databases here. The Land Cover database is a very popular one. LRIS Portal, Our Environment, and then many councils also have databases that they've created for different varieties of what coverage they have around their regions. So what is machine learning making possible? Well, really, it allows us to analyze massive data on a very detailed scale that we just can't quite do in other forms. It would take a long time and many people to do it on the ground level. It also has a higher relative resolution of spatial and temporal data distribution. And what I mean by this is that we get to really zoom in and get the details of what we've looked at. Now, what we found is that no one has really created a detailed index of New Zealand's biodiversity, and remote sensing and machine learning really can make this possible, sort of in a continuous and ongoing capacity as well. And that's a key point, is to keep it going through the development of our economy. Now, we're only at the very start of building our machine learning models, but we're very excited to look into the data that we have available and is coming available to us and add to the larger picture of our ecosystem. So I think that's my 5 minutes, and thank you very much.
Great, that was fantastic. Thank you, Kevan. So our next speaker is Aslan Wright-Stow. Aslan is a Senior Manager for Environment at Dairy NZ, working to raise dairy farmer environmental performance and ensure environmental policy drives the environmental outcomes it seeks. Tēnā koe, Aslan.
So a rather title in the slide there, and even more, I guess, crazy and ambitious is trying to discuss what leading efforts to improve water quality and biodiversity outcomes look like and mean for dairy within 5 minutes, but I'm going to give that a crack. So the title has been quite specific, and the reason for that is it's one of the objectives that sits within our 2018 Dairy Tomorrow strategy. And so what that strategy does is it essentially helps us to focus where we put our efforts in terms of behaviour change, in terms of on-the-ground change, and in terms of changes for the wider sector. So within Dairy Tomorrow, commitment 1, I'm biased, of course, but I think that there's 6 commitments in there, but commitment 1 being we will protect and nurture the environment for future generations. I'm entirely biased, thinking that should be commitment 1, but obviously it is a key issue for that nexus and that interface between a productive environment and the environment that it sits within. So commitment 1, protect and nurture the environment for future generations. Within that, we've got 4 goals, but specifically relating to biodiversity is the first of those. So leading efforts to improve the health of our rivers and streams and protect and enhance biodiversity. No mean feat, an extremely important challenge and commitment. So we've got a number of objectives underway to help us deliver on that. The first doesn't sound all that exciting, but it relates to good farming practice, GFP. You might have heard that approach. And I believe it's a really exciting piece of work that we're just in the process of launching, and that's to update GFP guidance for the environment. So the principles that sit below good farming, good dairy farming, good primary sector farming, to support environmental outcomes. So the process sounds simple. It's challenging in reality, but what it does is it gives us a framework, and it gives us some guidance as a sector and for every dairy farmer, in fact, to understand what good looks like. And from that, we can, through farm plans, we can set an approach to deliver on that good farming practice. But we go above and beyond because this is all about continuous improvement. So that process enables us to look above and beyond to what leading practice looks like. So a line of sight to enable good farming practice. The process and the systems being developed at the moment, but that'll enable every dairy farmer to understand where they sit in their environmental performance relative to industry agreed standards, if you like. And in doing that, that'll give a line of sight of where farmers are performing well and where more work needs to be done. And through that, actions can be identified for through farm plans. So it's a key approach to giving real clarity to farmers and enable us as a sector to monitor and report on progress. There's a bunch of work around farm environment plans, really, really important, fundamental to much of the work we do. Accelerated targeted extension programs and ensuring that farmers and others have the right resources and tools to make informed decisions. So the work builds on the Clean Streams Accord and the Sustainable Dairying Water Accord. And as I say, we've got farm environment plans sitting at the centre, that template, really, really valuable tool. There's some work in there around monitoring and reporting on nutrient use, demonstrating change at scale, and then importantly also analysing the outcomes. So that's been a real switch in focus for us in terms of Clean Streams Water Accord, Sustainable Dairying Water Accord, and then moving through to our Dairy Tomorrow commitments, which is really that focus on the outcomes, the so what, and being a little bit more bespoke and making sure that actions on farm are linked through to the outcomes and the needs that are most pertinent for that particular catchment. So that's kind of very whirlwind sort of overview. A few specifics relating to ecosystem health and biodiversity. We've got a really significant campaign, just wrapping up actually, in terms of monitoring MCI or Macroinvertebrate Community Index in a really large number of waterways throughout the country. So to enable us to better determine ecosystem health outcomes in dairy catchments. And we'll use that approach will allow us, in fact, to develop a citizen science monitoring program. So that's work that's coming up that will enable that better connection between individuals, landowners, and the environment that they sit in. And then this is my last slide, but there's also a need, and I'll put I guess an admission in here that a lot of the work that we've done in that biodiversity space has been as a co-benefit for water quality outcomes. Nothing wrong with that. Increasingly in the climate change space, greenhouse gas emissions space, those co-benefits, the sequestration, the locking up and kind of restoring of Indigenous biodiversity. We want to switch that a little bit further into really focusing in on ecosystem health in and of itself. So work and discussions that we've got underway with Eco Index in particular around figuring out how do we create a baseline, and then how can we use that baseline through some of the tools that Kevan was talking about, develop that, how can we test that and kind of ground truth that through farm plans and on the ground action, and then using that with some of those targets, those clarity to drive on the ground change for farmers. That's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aslan. And I would like to now welcome all our Eco Index speakers back to the virtual stage for a panel discussion and a little bit of Q&A. Just a reminder to our audience, there is a live Q&A button down there, so please do submit your questions as they come to you. I'd just like to start with a quick question of my own. I heard you speak a bit about baselines quite a bit and about that 15% goal. And I understand that for some that is going to be unfeasibly high and for others disappointingly low. There's one thing to speak of baselines. If we're talking 100 years, what is your desired future as a team? Where do you want to get? Is 15% what you want to see? What do you want to actually achieve, do you think is what we need to see for Aotearoa in terms of our biodiversity?
Well, I think, the 15% is a pretty challenging target as it is for a lot of lowland areas, particularly in our production landscapes. But, ideally, you would love to see achieved at a minimum, given that's generally what's considered the minimum threshold in literature around what's considered required to maintain biodiversity. And in terms of, but generally, I think in terms of the overarching vision is that, that there's this connectivity from the mountains to the sea and potentially, following our watersheds and waterways, so that there's this, sense as in, you could be pretty much in any regional catchment in the country and be able to feel that, you could pretty much walk via connected corridors from one place to another without ever stepping outside of native forest ecosystems. So that's kind of some of the sort of the vision that I personally have been thinking of, but I'm sure there's others in the team that have their own perspectives too.
Should we move on to another question? There's a couple that have come through the Q&A. One here for Aslan about the national good farming practices that you spoke of, those principles. The question is, who is in charge of them and who else can influence these?
Yeah, so I guess there's a number of layers, right? So the principles that I spoke to builds on work that was undertaken in a sort of a primary sector, not primary sector, a primary sector is a accidental slip of the tongue, that one. The combination of working primary sector, central government, regional government, and other stakeholders to develop what you might have seen is the Good Farming Practice Action Plan for Water Quality. So that's I guess a sector/government agreed set of principles. There's 21 principles in there. Well, and so in terms of answering that question, the ownership of that is that kind of that group, that collaborative group. What we've done, and the work that goes a little bit further, is we've taken that and we've put a bit more, well, quite a lot more actually, granularity that underpins that. This work's just about to be released, by the way. And so we're aiming as a sector to hold ourselves to account on this stuff. And so what we've said is, what would it take for every farmer in the country to be at good farming practice? And we acknowledge that there is a lot of work to do, and some of the ambitions we've got in there are just that, ambitious. So what would it take to get every farmer in the country at good farming practice for their nutrient management, their waterway management, their biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera? And so we've got a whole bunch of more detailed actions and requirements that sit in there that will enable us and farmers to understand where they sit, and we'll be able to track that through time. So in terms of ownership of that's I guess it's a dairy sector approach and dairy sector ownership. They will be put into the public domain, and through that process they'll be scrutinised. We hope that they're seen as ambitious and challenging. That's what we've held ourselves to account to.
Fantastic. There is only a minute left, so I just really quickly, you've seen the question in the chat from Bill about whether you've considered tracking investment in biosecurity surveillance for early detection to prevent pests and pathogens. Do you have an answer to that, Penny and John?
We did consider it, but to date we've not brought that data into our platform. There is opportunity to, particularly if it's in easily retrievable forms, but to date we haven't. It's just been slightly outside our scope, but it makes sense to, right, given that. But we've mainly stayed within our borders. So to speak, rather than the protection of external threat from the border. But clearly it is something that is required, right, to maintain our biodiversity health. So not excluded, but there's certainly opportunity to bring it in. The platform's ready for it.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll hand back to you, Andrea, to close this session.
Okay, kia ora no koutou. I'm going to wrap up this session on the Eco Index. I'd just like to thank again all of the speakers in this morning's session, including our keynote speaker. I haven't worked out the technology enough to be able to do the hand clap thing, but please join me in appreciating them. Do stick with us, return to the program timeline and join us in the networking session. Note also there's a discussion forum button below the video screen, so check out the comments in there and also the questions in the Q&A. I'd encourage the presenters also to please get into the Q&A and perhaps answer some of those amazing questions that are coming through. We're going to get ready for the next part of this session. It starts in exactly 10 minutes time. Kia ora, everybody.